also just segue into a little bit, just a little bit of information, which from what I know, I mean, as you know, you get your answers from many different sources. That one source will not give you everything. We are a small piece of the larger mosaic of information. But one thing I do know is that, hearts and minds can't be won without security. And if that is essentially what the guys are doing. That's why the SOAR guy just necessarily doesn't need to know, the intricacies of a kind of Afghan anthropology, because he has a job to bring security. And sometimes we ask quite a lot of our these young men, to ask them to start bringing this kind of hearts and minds war. In terms of security, sure, things in Afghanistan are in a worse way than they were in following 2002, 2003. But as a journalist, I'm always looking at statistics, and I work for Human Rights Watch. As Sebastian said, a lot of our work has been for them. And if you look at Human Rights Watch figures on the war for civilian casualties, a kind of important yardstick, it shows you that since 2001, since the NATO, US-led invasion, intervention, whatever you want to term it, 17,000 civilians have been killed. Now, if we round that up to 20,000, let's just do that, because that was done a couple of months ago, half a year ago or so.
I think the upper estimates are 30,000.
Okay, let's say
the ceiling.
So the ceiling of 30,000. Now that's awful. Like 30,000 innocent people have been killed as a direct result of the conflict, either by US forces, NATO forces, UK forces, Taliban, at 2/3 by the Taliban. And that's terrible, but that's nothing compared to the 400,000 that died in the decade earlier, when the Taliban and the Northern Alliance and the warlords fought it out. 400,000 died. And in fact, the decade earlier to that, between the Soviets, is between 1 million to 1.5 million. So in terms of just the raw data on civilians, that's kind of makes interesting. That's interesting reading for me. And just like Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Watch don't have a position on the war. It's not their job, to have a position on the war. They say that. And in the same way, like, I don't have a position on the war. I'm just looking at what the data is. What I do know is that talking to Afghans they're very concerned at the moment, the ones that I have spoken to, that if the US, they don't want the US there, the ones that I've spoken to, but they also know that if the US pulls out straight away now, that things will more likely than not descend into a kind of chaos that they were in the 90s. And they're afraid that it'll go back to those figures of the 400,000 that died. So you can't, I'm trying to then come back to your question about the locals, you can't, how can you possibly have a hearts and minds without establishing a security? And and that's, we're now in this kind of middle way of trying to hold on to security and do a hearts and minds, and it's a tricky